Hello everyone, I am Dr. Madhavi Moharil from the Department of English, Rajkumar Kevalramani Kanya Mahavidyalaya, Nagpur. I am going to give a presentation on a very wonderful short story, The Open Window, written by Hector U. Munro. Let us have an introduction of the writer. Hector U. Munro, also known by the pet name Saki, is a British writer and known as a master of short stories. Born in December 1870 and died in November 14, 1960, it means that he belongs to the 20th century literary world. He is especially known for his macabre stories and novels, which project something grim or ghastly atmosphere wonderfully woven into the plot of the short stories and novels. He worked as a journalist and as a writer. Readers can seek his inspiration from Oscar Wilde and Rudyard Kipling. For his wonderful style and skill, he is well compared with O. Henry and Dorothy Parker, very renowned names in the field of English literature. Best known for his peculiar style and his popular short stories like The Interlopers, The Toys of Peace, The Storyteller, Saki or Munro has left his long impression on the mind of the readers. So many short stories of Munro were broadcasted on radio and dramatized on television too. Saki had a military career during 1914 to 1916. The Open Window is a very impressive and wonderful story written by Saki. The story presents the skill of Saki as a short story writer. Let us have the introduction of the chief characters in the story. The foremost or the most important character in the story is Frampton Nuttall. Frampton Nuttall is an anxious gentleman, the one who gets excited very easily. He is the protagonist, or we can say that a leading character in the story. He has a fragile nerves. The second significant character is Vera. Vera is 15 years old girl. She is a niece of Mrs. Appleton. Vera is a very good storyteller. She is a notorious kind of a girl also. We enjoy her character in the story. The third important character is Mrs. Sapleton. Sapleton is a middle-aged woman. She is the owner of the home which is visited by Mr. Frampton. In this way, the story begins. Mr. Frampton Nuttall, a young man, a bachelor, is new in a town. Well aware of his nature, his sister feels that he would feel nervous at a new place, and so, to prevent from feeling lonely, she arranges a meeting of Frampton to her acquaintances. With a letter from his sister, Mr. Frampton comes to visit Mrs. Sapleton. And Frampton comes to visit Mrs. Sapleton along with a letter from his sister. At the home of Mrs. Sapleton, he meets Vera. He is welcomed by Vera, a young girl of 15. A young girl of 15 welcomes Mr. Frampton. Smart Vera asks him to sit and wait till her aunt comes down. She asks Frampton to sit and wait patiently till her aunt comes downstairs. These are some of the lines from the story. Mr. Nuttall is welcomed by Vera. She says, "My aunt will be down, Mr. Nuttall," said a very self-possessed young lady of 15. "In the meantime, you must try and put up with me." Frampton Nuttall tried to say a few words which would flatter both the nicety of the moment and the aunt that was to come. Privately, he doubted whether these formal visits on the total strangers would help the nerve cure which he was to undergo. In the beginning, he feels awkward, as his nature, which is suitable to his nature. He gets nervous, but he controls himself, and in a very balanced way, he speaks with Vera. Through a very casual conversation with a stranger, sharp, intelligent Vera comes to know that Frampton personally does not know anything about Mrs. Stapleton. He even does not know whether Mrs. Stapleton is a married one or a widow. He has never seen her before, only knows her name and address, which is given to him by his sister. Vera says, "Do you know many of the people around here?" asked the Nicey when she thought that they had been silent long enough. "Hardly anybody," said Frampton. "My sister was staying here at the rectory, about 4 years ago, and she gave me letters of introduction to some of the people here." "Then you know practically nothing about my aunt?" continued the young lady. She confirms that Frampton does not know anyone in this town. He is new, and he has not seen Mrs. Stapleton ever before. Notorious Vera says, her great tragedy happened just 3 years ago. She was speaking about Mrs. Stapleton. Simple Frampton trust in Vera. "Her tragedy?" asked Frampton. Somehow, in this restful country spot, tragedy seemed out of place. Vera, with her skill, starts weaving the story and says, "You may wonder why we keep that window wide open on a cold October afternoon," said the Nicey, pointing to a large French window that opened onto a lawn. "It is quite warm for the time of the year," said Frampton. "But has that window got anything to do with her tragedy?" Vera's story reaches to climax. In a very panicked and suspicious tone, she says, "Out through that window 3 years ago, her husband and her two young brothers went off for their day's shooting. They never came back. In crossing the moor, they were engulfed in a treacherous part of the marsh. Their bodies were never recovered. That was the dreadful part of it." To make the listener believe in her story, Vera shows sympathy to her aunt with sympathetic words. She says, "Poor aunt always thinks that they will come back someday. They and the little brown spaniel that was lost with them and walked in through that window just as they used to do. That's why the window is kept open every evening until dusk." And she thrillingly puts forward the reasons of keeping the window open. She adds with fear in her voice, "I almost get a creepy feeling that they will all walk in through that window." It is very clear that while describing such things, she minutely observes Mr. Frampton and enjoys the trust of the reader on her. She makes him to believe that all she has said to Mr. Frampton, it is having a particular impact on this man. Meanwhile, Mrs. Stapleton comes downstairs. She knows Vera very well. She says, "I hope Vera has been amusing you." "She has been very interesting." Very casually she asks Mr. Frampton, "I hope you don't mind the open window." To Frampton, it is all purely horrible. He sincerely believes in Vera. Mrs. Stapleton's explanation that she has left the window open for her husband and brothers, who would soon return from the shooting, makes Mr. Frampton's fear very strong. See the expressions on the face of Mr. Frampton. Mr. Frampton strongly believes in Vera's story and receives the conversation of Mrs. Stapleton in that context. He looks to Vera with great fear and aghast at the greenness of the situation. Vera responds by look out of the window, horrified. He attempts to change the conversation, but Mrs. Sapleton, excited by the remarks that her husband would come soon. Now Mr. Frampton feels terrible and informs that the doctor has ordered him complete rest from the mental excitements and the violent physical exercises. Here the reader gets involved with the situation and enjoys Frampton's reactions and Vera's skill. Now the story reaches to its peak. Mrs. Sepleton cries, "Here they are at last." Her sincere joy and expressions make Frampton to believe in Vera and feels the most terrible. He shivers. Notorious Vera reacts with dramatic horror in her eyes. Mr. Frampton prepares to leave the place with fear and grasps wildly his stick and hat. The cyclist coming along the road avoids colliding with him. Frampton runs away with fear. Mrs. Sapleton is surprised to see such a reaction by Mr. Frampton, and she says, "A most extraordinary man, Mr. Nuttall." Now Vera takes another opportunity and gets another set of listeners to her next story. Now she tells the story of Mr. Frampton. She says, "I think it was the spaniel," said the Nancy calmly. "He told me he had a horror of dogs." He means Mr. Nuttall. "He was once hunted into a cemetery somewhere on the banks of the Ganges by a pack of wild dogs and had to spend the night in a newly dug grave with the creature snarling and grinning and foaming just above him, enough to make anyone lose his nerves." In this story, she tells the story of Mr. Nuttall. It shows great skill of Vera of storytelling. These are some of the features of the story and some of the chief qualities of Saki as a short story writer. The speciality of the story is seen in the projection of Vera, a very skilled storyteller. First story is told to Mr. Frampton about Mrs. Sapleton, which he believes as true and reacts very sincerely. Vera gets Mr. Frampton as a very sincere listener, the one who believes in her, who trusts in her and her story. The second story is told to Mrs. Sapleton and the other members of the family. They also trust in Vera and feels it as true. The writer pens out the situations very effectively to support the stories told by Vera. In fact, both the stories, they are just the imagination of Vera. They are just the skill of Vera weaving the stories through the characters. Saki portrays the character of Vera with a great skill and authority. The story presents Saki's wit, irony, and tongue-in-cheek humor. It brings out the art of telling a tale. The readers are amused with the character of Vera. On one hand, the readers feel sympathy for a very gentleman, Mr. Frampton. At the same time, the readers enjoy the character of Vera for her wit, for her skill, and for her talent.